everyone and welcome to Buenos Pages. Today we're talking about Dracula. This is part 4 of the video. Hopefully we're going to be finishing up the series soon because I know there's a lot to get through, but these chapters are shorter and quicker. Last time we left off with Seward finding out that actually Lucy is the one who has been leaving these marks on the children's necks according to Van Helsing, and let's dive straight in. For a while, sheer anger mastered me. It was as if he had during her life struck Lucy on the face. Seward's first reaction to not understanding is anger. Like Quincy, he views anything that he does not understand as an affront to his manhood, because during the time, Victorian society would have really valued dignity and pride and this idea of reputation. And for a man, because reputation was above all else and his duty and his honor was the first thing that they put on the line, to be made a fool out of was the same as being ridiculed. It was an affront to one's manhood. It was an affront to one's dignity. It was a grave offense. And so essentially what Seward is finding out here is that you're so stupid you don't understand that it's Lucy who's doing this, number one, and number two, your love is the one committing these horrible acts against innocent children. And he begins to wonder if Van Helsing is potentially mad for proposing this. Again, we see the theme of, is someone mad, or are they just misunderstood by society? Madness were easy to bear compared with truths like this, is the professor's reply. True ignorance in this situation would be bliss, because to admit to the existence of the undead here is to essentially watch the foundations of everything that you have built your knowledge upon crumble away. Because if you believe in the undead, then what's stopping you from believing in God when you're an atheist? Or believing in all those things that previously science has considered impossible? And for a man of science, that's your entire career. So has your entire life been a lie? We see the struggle between traditional methods and folklore and sort of common knowledge, something that your grandma would whisper to you like, oh, those silly superstitions, like don't walk under the ladder, or at least what Seward considers silly. We see them prevail over science. We see them prevail over things that he has known all his life. And Van Helsing, understanding that this is difficult for a man to bear, uses the scientific approach to explain. A man does not like to prove such a truth. Byron accepted from the category jealousy and proved the truth he most abhorred. So this is a quote from Don Juan. It's a truth that no one wants to admit, but it must be admitted for the greater good. And so Van Helsing sets out to prove his point because he knows that this is for the greater good and that although he risks everything, this is a risk that he must take in order to save the world from evil. First, they go to the hospital and they see a recently bitten child. There was no mistaking the similarity to those wounds which had been on Lucy's throat. They were smaller and the edges looked fresher, that was all. So where Dracula is physically bigger and stronger because he's a man, where he bites the neck and he feeds and he sort of treats it carelessly because it's a sexual violation, for Lucy the act is much more precise. She spots a child, she spots a victim, and it's a matter of drinking their blood because it's a way to sustain her own life forces and her own undead long-lasting beauty. This is the first piece of evidence. They then go down to the tomb and they open the creaky door, of course being a staple of the Gothic setting, and this is evidence number 2. So the professor politely motions for Seward to go on. There was a delicious irony in the offer, in the courtliness of giving preference on such a ghastly occasion. Even in such situations, Victorian society somehow manages to uphold the values that they were taught, the values they are used to. In the chaos, we cling to what we have already known. They enter the tomb and find it completely broken down. The fresh flowers hung lank and dead, their whites turning to rust and their greens to browns. This is the obvious symbol of life being lost. I mean, the rust, the pure white becomes tainted. It turns into rust, the color of blood, and the green, that bright green symbolizing youth and having connotations of life and joy, has been turned into brown, a symbol of decay, a symbol of darker times to come. And we have seen an example of this earlier, using nature as foreshadowing when Jonathan was writing to the Count's castle. And then what happens is that Van Helsing opens the coffin and inside there is no body. Seward is shocked. He does not expect this in the slightest, but Van Helsing, of course, being used to vampires, knows that Lucy has been out to wander. Still, Seward seeks to explain the inexplainable. It's essentially the cognitive dissonance. His brain is not allowing him to process what he believes is impossible, what doesn't align with his clear viewpoint of this is science and there must be a logical explanation for this. Suddenly, they see a white streak passing by because they decide to hold vigil. As Van Helsing says, well, if you don't trust me, see for yourself. So they wait, and then there's a white streak. Lucy, of course, in her nightgown, and they see a child. They quickly intervene and they manage to get there just in time. Lucy leaves, so he doesn't actually see Lucy, and the child doesn't have a wound in her neck. If the child did have a wound in her neck, I wonder if it would have been easier for Seward to potentially accept, but still, he's not piecing together the information. The fact that Lucy was wearing white when they buried her, the white streak, the fact that children are showing up in the vicinity of her chamber, and of course the words of Van Helsing, his professor for many years. Van Helsing tells him to open the tomb again, and it seemed the height of folly to do so when they knew from the evidence of our own eyesight. You can't even trust your own eyes anymore. Everything that Seward has known begins to fall apart, quite literally. He almost doesn't want to open it and see, because what would it mean if Lucy was inside? And there she is, more radiantly beautiful than before. The lips were red, nay, redder than before, and on the cheeks was a delicate bloom. So clearly there's been other children that she's been feeding on, as evidenced by the newspaper, and also by the fact that she's being brought back to life. Like Dracula, the life forces of others may sustain her. This is Van Helsing's final point. Most peoples in that time would not look so. Seward knows so himself. A week passes and people begin to decay, their bodies begin to swell, certainly not look like an angel or a rose in bloom. Seward trusts Van Helsing to just do it. Just proceed with whatever mutilation you want. But again, Van Helsing deters because of Arthur, who we know that he cares for because he reminds him of his own son who has sadly died. He doesn't behead Lucy because he doubted me when I took him from her kiss when she was dying. I know he has forgiven me because in some mistaken idea I have done things that prevent him say goodbye as he ought, and he may think that in some more mistaken idea this woman was buried alive, and that in most mistake of all we have killed her. He will then argue back that it is we, mistaken ones, that have killed her by our ideas, and so he will be much unhappy always. Yet he can never be sure, and that is the worst of all. So the two leave and plan to return later, but in the morning Seward changes his mind and writes in his diary that it seems that Van Helsing is mad. Yesterday he was quite willing to accept his ideas, but it is wonderful what a good night's sleep will do for one. So during the day we seek rationality. The night is not as rational. The night is not as logical. The night is scary and terrifying. And so of course we're willing to accept these theories that now Seward is eager to dismiss, and he decides to give Van Helsing the benefit of the doubt and not quite commit him to an institution yet, and let him speak with the other men. So Van Helsing tells Quincy and Arthur is outraged, and he says that not for the wide world will I consent to any mutilation of her dead body. Dr. Van Helsing, you try me too far. But by Van Helsing's earnest explanations of duty, he convinces him. I have a duty to do a duty to others, a duty to you, a duty to the dead, and by God I shall do it. He also says that he has come all this way to England from the Netherlands to do good, to care for Lucy. He has given her his blood, he admits to the transfusion finally, and he has given her his nights and days. He has given her the most precious resource of all, time. Arthur is moved by the earnest monologue because for him, like for gentlemen of the Victorian period, duty is above all else, and he agrees to go with Van Helsing at the very least to see what is going on. And we move on to chapter 16. Van Helsing, Seward, Arthur, and Morris go to Lucy's tomb on September 29th. But aware what this is going to look like, Van Helsing asks for Seward to vouch that last time they visited, the coffin was empty. They ask permission to open the coffin. They open the coffin. Indeed, it is empty. Morris says, I wouldn't do dishonor you as to imply a doubt, but this is a mystery that goes beyond any honor or dishonor. Is it your doing? Morris is not in the least concerned about vampirism or anything of the kind. Honestly, the sweet-natured and funny young man cares about whether he's being made a fool. If Harker is the stereotypical British man who eats bland food and is scared of the unknown, and of course England is better, Then Quincy is the stereotypical American cowboy who takes everything in his stride, and he doesn't really care what's going on. He just cares that he isn't made a fool of. That's when Van Helsing explains that Lucy's now the undead and can move when the sun is down. Yesterday, he placed flowers and he rubbed garlic. Today, he removed them, and so now there's nothing preventing Lucy from going out. That is why she's gone. In the reactions of the men, we see their different personalities. Arthur was silent, striving to grasp the purpose and the inner meaning of the mystery. He's usually a calm gentleman, and he behaves that way here too, wondering on his love and the meaning. Quincy accepts them in the spirit of full bravery. Not being able to smoke, he cut himself a good-sized plug of tobacco and began to chew. Again, the traditional image of masculinity. He doesn't feel he can adequately express his emotions and stress, and so turns to a simple coping mechanism. Van Helsing is ever the composed, knowing doctor. He simply lets them process it and begins sealing the tomb. He then points at Lucy, who's feeding herself on a fair-haired child. My own heart grew cold as ice, and I could hear the gasp of Arthur as we recognized the features of Lucy Westerna. Lucy Westerna, but yet how changed! The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. How ironic is it now that her name is Westerna, when the West has fallen influence to the occult ways of the East? She's no longer Lucy, simple, sweet Lucy, a simple name for a simple girl. She's Lucy Westerna in her demonic female rage. Instead of her usual pure, gentle orbs, her eyes are clean and full of hellfire. These eyes are often referred to as the windows of the soul, so again we see the contrast between her previous gentle nature and new demonic one. Lucy turns to Arthur and asks him to join her. My arms are hungry for you. Her tone is described as diabolically sweet. Again, that idea of sweet poison. Those three women who tempt you with their sexual being, but if you sleep with the fallen woman, then there's a punishment. This idea that Victorian society propagates. This idea of the vagina dentatis, also the nether regions have teeth, you will be punished. This idea of don't give in to the temptation, this was the original sin of Adam and Eve. And Arthur falls into this because it's his true love. Like a spell, he approaches towards her, but again Van Helsing saves him, brandishing the golden crucifix and pulling him back. In fury, Lucy manages to escape through the cracks, like a spirit, like a wraith. Where Dracula is more of a man, potentially because of his masculine energy, Lucy is more gentle, more calm, more stereotypically feminine. She instead haunts the vicinity of her grave and her tomb where she was buried. Maybe she seeks to go to the eastern cliff and to sit on her favorite spot. She still holds those same gentle habits as she did in life, though twisted and perverse now. Arthur allows Van Helsing to kill Lucy because there can be no horror like this ever anymore. Van Helsing says there is no more done today, so they will come back tomorrow. Perhaps because they were unprepared for her escape, she did manage to just go through a thin sliver of a crack, or perhaps because he wants to give Arthur a chance to reconcile himself with the idea and to say his final goodbyes. They come back the next day. She seemed like a nightmare of Lucy as she lay there, the pointed teeth, the blood-stained voluptuous mouth, which made one shudder to see, the whole carnal and unspiritual appearance seeming like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. Van Helsing then explains that if Arthur had gone to Lucy, he would have become Nosferatu, and would also help in making the undead. Lucy is the undead because she has not been killed correctly. She has been killed by an undead being, and if they truly kill her now, then she will take her place with the other angels. He instructs him to take a stake and drive it straight through Lucy's heart because this is the only thing that will free her. And then they read from the holy book, and this is also the only thing that will free Arthur's heart. He hesitates but does it, and the body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut and the mouth was smeared with a crimson figure. Arthur doesn't stop, and his face shined with high duty, and finally the body lies still. Notice how dehumanizing the description is. The body. This isn't quite Lucy what he's killing. He's killing the demonic shade living instead of her soul. By driving the stake, he releases her pure and true soul. Her features take onto a peaceful nature. She acquires rest. This is the promise of Christian salvation. This is what helps Arthur commit the deed. And here I can't help but think, how many atrocious deeds were also justified with this religious promise? Because essentially what they're doing is they're trusting, they're blindly trusting. And yes, there's a requirement to believe that you need to blindly trust, but where do we draw those boundaries? Is it for when we do it for something that's inherently good? But how do we know when something is inherently good? There in the coffin lay no longer the foul thing that we had so dreaded and grown to hate, that the work of her destruction was yielded as a privilege to the one best entitled to it. But Lucy as we had seen her in her life, with her face of unequaled sweetness and purity. Finally, Arthur kissed her, and then the professor saws off her head and fills the mouth with garlic. Very representative of Victorian treatment of women not who were not pure, cutting them off with family and friendships. They finally finish the deed and go out, and the air seems lighter. Now they decide to do the same to Dracula. This is a very short chapter, and it's honestly a bit about tying up loose ends. Van Helsing finds a telegram from Mina saying that she's heading up to London. Jonathan is currently at Whitby. Van Helsing gives the telegram to Seward to read, and he also gives him Harker's diary so he can prepare. The next day, Seward meets Mina at the station, and Mina writes again what a sweet and well-mannered gentleman this guy seems to be, very much like what Lucy described. Everyone needs to be on the same page for the climax of the novel, the hunt for Dracula, and so this chapter is more about just getting everyone to find out what happened. Mina talks with Seward of the phonograph. So where she has the shorthand, he has his phonograph. It's sort of like a tape. It's like a diary, but a diary to which he speaks. And I think it's because he's lonely, to be honest, because at the asylum there's not many to talk to. And she would like to type it up and add it to the transcripts. So actually, what we're reading is what she's writing. So it's a very self-aware type of experience. It's a sort of meta moment, and I think it would be something that we would expect in modernist novels of the time. Modernist novels or postmodernist novels, but definitely not novels of the time. So again, Stoker shows just how far ahead he was. This is a wonderful machine, but it's cruelly true. It told me in its very tones the anguish of your heart. Mina is greatly touched and emotional because although it is distressing and difficult to read about your friend getting mutilated and about the struggles of your friend, she knows how useful it is to have a written record, how useful it is to have everyone be somewhere where they can understand. Yes, he prefers shorthand, that's Jonathan, or yes, he prefers phonograph, but they all need to be on the same page to tackle Dracula. And so I think here she's being the perfect lady journalist that she has wanted to be. She's realizing her own ambitions. She emphasizes the importance of the whole group fighting Dracula together. She shows herself to be a courageous and resistant female character that we all needed in this novel to bring the men with their difference and their stubbornness and their sometimes frankly inability to see the obvious before them. She's the smart woman, she's the pure good Christian woman. And what she does is she also convinces all of them to read. And what this means is that they're all reading the journals. So we're reading a book where the characters read a book about themselves. So again, mind-blowing meta moment. Seward has to give Mina some brandy at some point because Mina is swaying from the effort, but she shows herself to be incredibly stoic. So isolating her later on is perhaps just the male ego playing out rather than her inability to handle it. Well, he gives her some brandy, she calms down, and the next day he meets with Harker, who he describes as an uncommonly clever man. I wonder where that cleverness was when he ignored all the signs. Mina certainly didn't. But from reading the journals, Seward manages to figure out that actually Renfield's behavior is associated with the Count because the asylum is right next to the Carfax estate. And so we figure out that since Renfield is calm, it must mean that Dracula is currently not nearby, so they're not in danger and they have this time to prepare. Harker also makes an important realization that the astute reader would have figured out literally chapters ago. The 50 boxes are pretty important. So Harker meets with Billington and resolves to find out where the boxes are now so he can destroy them. He's convinced that they're in a basement in Carfax, building off of his previous experience with Dracula storing them in Carfax. Talks to the dock workers who tell him that the boxes were very heavy, and so Dracula carries them with them because it's the Mother Earth, it's his motherland. Morris and Arthur also finally read the journals and are now ready to help. Quincy's just there for the sense of adventure and because he's personally invested in it, I guess, but for Arthur, clearly it's a sense of duty and revenge and avenging his love Lucy. I also forgot to mention that Mina comforted Seward earlier on in these chapters, so Seward really needed a shoulder to cry on, and she was happy to be that friend, and she was happy to be a loving and a motherly presence with her womanly instincts, and she's happy to make these new friendships, though she is a bit surprised by the outburst of emotion, because I mean, she's holding it in, so why aren't you? It's sort of implied like, yeah, I'm happy for a man to be emotional, but also if I'm fine, why are you not fine? Pull yourself together. And she kisses Quincy to comfort him, feeling he's less open about his emotions. Little girl, you will never regret that true-hearted kindness, so long as you ever live. On that note, with a reminder of Mina's heartfelted and kind nature, who's far from this like sexual kissing or sexual engagement with men, but engagement from the purity of her heart, the chapter ends. Mina wants to visit Renfield, and Seward sees no reason to stop her. He informs Renfield of the fact, and Renfield even cleans his room. And when Mina shows up, he thinks that she's Lucy, but then he remembers that Lucy is dead. And he outwardly says this. For Seward and Mina, this is shocking. How can he know? But Renfield replies, "Since I myself have been an inmate of a lunatic asylum, I cannot but notice that the sophistic tendencies of some of its inmates lean towards the errors of non causa and ignoratio elenchi." Of course I know, because Dr. Seward, you are important. Suddenly Renfield becomes this perfect gentleman, this educated young man who doesn't seem insane in the slightest. It's unclear whether this is Mina's influence as a good woman, but more likely Renfield just wants to escape the asylum, either for Dracula's bidding or for his own. Regardless, Mina manages to bring him onto his own favorite topic, because Mina's doing some investigating of her own, and Renfield says that, like, oh, I'm not really interested in this anymore. Yes, I believe that blood can infinitely prolong life and we can live forever, but souls, no, I'm over that business. So it's sort of implied that he's like Dracula in that he wants to go through this ritual, but he also doesn't want to become Dracula. He says that he's over that business, but Seward doesn't want to believe him, especially because before seeing Mina, he cleaned up his room by eating the flies, so clearly not completely over it. Seward gets concerned about Mina spending time with a madman because, of course, oh, she's a gentle woman, she's going to go crazy, never mind that she's the one who's been piecing this whole story together, and he sends her off. For her part, Mina obediently goes off, and I once again, I think it's so interesting how Mina is like this go-getter, this independent woman, but everyone seems to constantly put her down and say that you can't do it, and she seems to agree, when clearly her actions show the opposite. Later, Seward reflects on Mina. She has a man's brain, a brain that a man should have, were he much gifted, and a woman's heart. So very much the perspective of the time. Yeah, women are emotional, women are not rational, it's the men who are rational. If a woman is blessed with this power, it's not because she's a woman and she can be smart, it's because she has a man's brain inside of her. Renfield also blessed Mina before she left, so it seems like it's a sort of protection and for her own good. On the 30th of September, Mina records a meeting of the group where they finally go through the characteristics of the vampires, or the Nosferatu. Van Helsing gives the following characteristics. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he stings once, so they can strike many times more. They are inhumanly strong in person as 20 men. They are cunning. For his cunning, he the growth of ages. They know necromancy. All the dead are for him at command. They are evil. He's devil and callous. They can, within limitations, appear at will. They can direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder, and the animals: rats, cats, owls, moths, fox, wolves. Van Helsing also highlights that to fail here is not just to die. They would become foul things of the night like him. It's hard to fight Dracula, but they are not without strength. We have on our side of power of combination, a power denied to the vampire kind. We have resources of science, we are free to act and think, and the hours of the day and the night are ours equally. We have self-devotion and a cause and an end to achieve what is not a selfish one. Basically, they have Christian ideals on their side rather than concrete methods. All we have to go upon are traditions and superstitions. He then gives more characteristics of Dracula, things the observant reader would have already known. He has no shadow, no reflection, he does not eat a human diet, he can transform into a wolf, he's inhumanly strong, he can be a bat, he can come in he can command mist, which he himself created, but the distance of that mist is limited. He can come as dust, he can become small, he can leave anywhere he wants, he can see in the dark, but that being said, he has limitations. He cannot come unless he's invited. During the day his power ceases. He can only change himself at noon or at sunrise unless he's at the place to which he's bound. That is why he has those coffins of dirt with him. He's scared of garlic and the crucifix. The branch of a wolf rose can prevent him from leaving the coffin, and a sacred bullet fired can also kill him as well as the stake. Van Helsing has asked a fellow researcher at Budapest, and he traced Dracula's origins to the voivode Dracula, who won his name against the Turks. So actually, Dracula comes from this very fine line of like rich aristocrats, as we gathered from the very first chapters. That's why he spoke so highly of the purity of race, and he was considered the bravest and also the most cunning of them all, and sadly for them, he took these qualities with him to the grave. So they're fighting against a man who has years of experience. And Dracula seems to be a corruption of what is good. So initially he was good, but something has twisted him, potentially wealth, the buried treasure, and that is why they must destroy the boxes. They resolve it to do it together, but to Mina they say, "You are too precious to us to have such risk." It's not only a matter of Mina being endangered, but also because she can be the key to the solution, their star and hope. Seward introduces them all to Renfield as well, and they're shocked by the transformation given the man's character and history. Clearly, Renfield wants to get out, and I think the reason is that he's terrified because he begs them to send him home. "For the sake of the Almighty, take me out of this and save my soul from guilt." Seward and Van Helsing refuse, and Renfield, perhaps foreshadowing his own death, just shrugs and gives up, telling Seward, "Do me the justice to bear in mind later on that I did what I could to convince you tonight. It's on you." Minus Mina, the group goes to investigate Carfax and they come prepared. They come with revolvers, knives, silver crucifixes, and small electric lamps. They also wear wreaths of garlic. So the revolver and knives are for normal enemies, the rest is for unnatural ones. Dr. Seward uses a skeleton key to break in the rusty lock, which hasn't been used for literally years, showing that Dracula has not been coming in through human ways. He's been shifting, transforming into a bat, whatever, getting into the house. When Helsing says, "In manus tuas, domine," meaning by the hands of the Lord, he crosses himself and then they enter. The lamps make random shadows and they can't get away from the feeling that there was someone else amongst us. The whole place was thick with dust. The floor was seemingly inches deep, except where there were recent footsteps in which, on holding down my lamp, I could see marks of hobnails where the dust was caked. The walls were fluffy and heavy dust, and in the corners were masses of spiders' webs, whereon the dust had gathered till they looked like old tattered rags, as the weight had torn them partly down. On a table in the hall was a great bunch of keys, with a time-yellowed label on each. The whole place is in disarray. It's old and crumbling and falling apart, much like Dracula is, I suppose. On the inside, he's also barely standing. His soul is rotting. They then make their way to the chapel, which has an incredibly foul odor. The air was stagnant and foul. It was composed of all the ills of mortality and with the pungent, acrid smell of blood, but it seemed as though corruption had become itself corrupt. They then end up finding 29 boxes out of the 50. They destroy them, and then the place swarms with rats, till the lamplight shining on their moving dark bodies and glittering baleful eyes made the place look like a bank of earth set with fireflies. Then, because the group came prepared, they take a dog and they set the dog onto the rats, and the dogs chase the rats away. With their going, it seemed as if some evil presence had departed, for the dogs frisked about and barked merrily. They then purify the deadly atmosphere by opening the door, by destroying half of the boxes, they have ensured that Dracula is already half weakened. He does not have his motherland, and those rats are perhaps the remains of his ancestors. They go back to the house, and Jonathan finds Mina peacefully sleeping, breathing so softly that I had to put my ear down to hear it. She looks paler than usual. Oh no. Jonathan is clueless. He just thinks to himself that Mina is under too much strain. It's good they're leaving her out. It is too great a strain for a woman to bear. The next day she complains about being tired, and so Jonathan doesn't bother her for the rest of the day, and he busies himself with tracking down the rest of the boxes. Cut to Mina's journal, where she writes of her fatigue. She writes about how she can't remember how she went to sleep the other night, but she hears the sudden barking of the dogs and a lot of queer sounds like braying on a very tumultuous scale. She also sees a spreading mist lying thick against the wall as though it were stealing up to the windows. So she feels a sudden lethargy and she can't move, and of course we realize that it's much like Dracula's hypnosis, and we're not the only ones because Mina is much more astute than the rest of the characters, and so she realizes what's happening and faints with shock. She sees the fire divided and seemed to shine on me through the fog like two red eyes, such as Lucy told me of in her momentary mental wandering. Her last conscious effort was a livid white face bending over me out of the mist. Mina dismisses it as a dream, and she sinks into a tired sleep without dreaming. Renfield visits her and kisses her hand and bids her God bless. Mina is so worried and uneasy and terrified, and somehow she forgets that Dracula came to visit her, though in her dreams she realized, and she asks for a sleeping draught. But now a new fear comes, that I may have been foolish in thus depriving myself of the power of waking. I might want it. She says that, and then she goes to sleep. So poor Mina is left without protection at the mercy of Dracula. Jonathan speaks with one of the men who moved the boxes to Carfax, and this man is a lower class, so a working class man, and it's clear that he's enjoying kind of pulling Jonathan's leg, because since Jonathan is now a wealthy man, the man understands that he's a wealthy man by his accent, by his upbringing, and so at the time, Jonathan would have been the sort of man to employ the working class man, and so it's rare that a rich man comes to him and asks for help, and he's not his employer and he's not obligated to speak to him respectfully, so of course he's enjoying this. Working class people were treated with such contempt by upper class people, and the resentment was clearly mutual, so they also made fun of their fashion and their accents, and so we see that here. Later on, another worker tells Jonathan that a potential place could be a house in Piccadilly, and this is where we get to the disturbing part. Later, before this, we have seen that Dracula was stalking this woman in Piccadilly, so it's in the center of London. The enemy is amongst us, and not just like in a poor region, but at the very heart of London, the rich part, the touristy area. Now we find out he even has a house there at the center of London in a populated and expensive region, and this also subverts Gothic expectations because I mean, a rich house at the center of Piccadilly, that's not something you would expect from the Gothic crumbling and decaying castles. The workman tells Jonathan that actually the boxes were super heavy, but Dracula lifted them almost exerting no effort, and he told him to leave, but there wasn't a key. Jonathan asked for a description of the house. It's a high one with a stone front with a bow in it and high steps up to the door. Jonathan easily finds the house because it's again in a state of decay and disarray like Dracula. The house looked as though it had been long untenanted. The windows were encrusted with dust and the shutters were up. All the framework was black with time, and from the iron the paint had mostly scaled away. In the very first video, we read Dracula's monologue about his loneliness and wanting to have a house with a history. Now that very human sentiment of wanting to feel comfortable in your own space is being exploited. Having gotten the promise to get the name of the house's buyer from a lawyer who knows Lord Arthur, Jonathan goes home, where he meets with the others and tells him about his day, but he sees Mina being poor Mina being more pale than ever. I took Mina to her room and left her to go to bed. The dear girl was more affectionate with me than ever and clung to me as though she would detain me, but there was much to be talked of, and I came away. Stoker keeps leaving these clues to remind us of poor Mina's well-being and her own slow transformation into a vampire. I mean, her symptoms mirror Lucy's word for word, but nobody pieces it together. And Quincy reminds Arthur that they cannot simply break into Dracula's house because it's in a public place. But back to Renfield, who no longer seems interested, and implies, oh no, I want no souls. Life is all I want. Here he brightened up. I'm pretty indifferent about it at present. Life is all right. I have all I want. You must get a new patient doctor if you want to study zoophagy. He also mentions that he does not want to be a god. He wants to walk by God's side, so he wants to be an accomplice because I know that I shall never lack the means of life. Again, an allusion to the unimaginable riches that Dracula has promised him. Through prying more at Renfield and asking him to consider the souls and kind of prompting his human guilt, Seward manages to deduce the following about Renfield. Will not mention drinking, fears the thought of being burdened with the soul of anything, has no dread of wanting life in the future, despises the meaner forms of life altogether, though he dreads being haunted by their souls. Logically, all these things point one way. He has assurance of some kind that he will acquire some higher life. He dreads the consequence, the burden of a soul. Then it is a human life he looks to, and the assurance, merciful God, the Count has been to him, and here there is some new scheme of terror afoot. So finally, Seward pieces it together, and at this point, Arthur receives a letter from the law company saying that, of course, we will help you. We respect your father so much. The buyer's name is Count de V. Arthur is rich, so it's literally that easy. Where the poor Jonathan has to literally wriggle and writhe to get this information. For the rich, it's that simple. Again, Stoker makes a very poignant commentary on the nature of wealth and the opportunities that it opens, because it's not just about economic capital. I agree with Baudrillard completely here. It's about the social capital. It's about the wealth of connections you have. Simply knowing Lord Arthur's name is enough to get them that information. The group then prepares for their trip to catch Dracula, and clearly it requires a lot of wealth to buy everything, like the revolvers, the flowers, the crucifix, the trip. I mean, if they were less better off, potentially they would have not been able to catch Dracula. They would have simply not had the opportunity. Stewart then reflects on whether or not this is all madness, in fact, because it's no longer quite a game, since they're not just breaking into some unknown property, they're breaking into an expensive property at the center of London. It's clearly not a game anymore. This is serious, and his musings get interrupted with Renfield has somehow met with some accident. He had heard him yell, and when he went to him, found him lying on his face on the floor, all covered with blood. I must go at once. On that note, the chapter ends and I will continue in the next video. I am hoping to finally finish the book in the next series, so thank you so much for making it this far. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you soon.